Shabbat Shalom. Today the parasha is Vayeshev, and the message was written by Mauricio Quintero, and I'll be happy to read it in English in the translation. It's entitled, How Do We Get Out of the Pit? Tehillim 40, verses 2 and 3 say, I have greatly hoped in the Lord, and he extended his ear to me and heard my cry. And he brought me out of the thundering pit, out of the thick mud, and he set my feet on the rock. He established my steps. I think that when the Maccabean struggle began and we were facing a larger, better trained, and better equipped army, Matityahu, the high priest, and his family probably felt like they were in the muddy pit when they cried out, "What a disgrace! To have been born to see the ruin of my people and the holy city, and to have to stay with my arms crossed while it falls into the hands of its enemies, and the temple remains in the power of foreigners. Why continue living?" That's from 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 8 and 13. Have you ever been in a swamp? Several years ago, my family and I were traveling during a beach break to a mangrove swamp called Barra de Santiago. When the tide goes out, the water level drops. The tide had gone out, causing our boat to run aground in the swamp. My children, who were ages 4 and 6, and other family members were all in the boat. It was nighttime, and there were crocodiles. The guide asked me to please help me push the boat. So here I was in this swamp, deep in thick mud. With every step, I was sinking up to my thighs. It was so difficult to walk, and honestly, I was terrified. I was afraid of the crocodiles, the darkness. I couldn't see anything, and the mud was disgusting. I had to wash myself over and over again afterwards. I was disoriented by the darkness from the anxiety, the humidity, and the sheer filth. I never want to go through that again. In this portion, Vayeshev, the Torah teaches us about Jacob and his generations, about how a fledgling nation was formed out of chaos. Why do I say out of chaos? Well, Jacob had lost his beloved Rachel. He had caused division in his own family because of his favoritism of Joseph. His son Reuben was absent when his brothers were sold. When Joseph was sold, he might have been in a depression from the mistake he made with his father's concubine Bilhah. All of Joseph's brothers were envious of him, to the point that the Torah says that they couldn't even speak peaceably with him. They hated him and conspired to kill him, which ended instead with his being sold as a slave, as Judah had suggested. The chaos caused sadness and pain for Jacob. In fact, it was as if he had descended alive to Sheol and ended with the separation of his family. From that day on, they lost Joseph and Judah, who later both became the royal tribes, leaders of Israel. The phrase used in verse 37:24 is interesting. And they took him and threw him into the pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Wasn't it enough to say that it was an empty pit? Did they have to add that there was no water in it? The pit symbolizes death, the abyss. If we look at Tehillim 34, it says, "You, Lord, brought me out of Sheol. You gave me life. You saved me from the pit," which in Hebrew is Bet Vav Resh, bor. The word bor appears twice in the accounts of Joseph's life. Once in the verse 37:24, vehabor, and another 41:14, minhabor, where it's translated as dungeon. Joseph felt abandonment not only once in his life, but twice. Abandoned twice. This humiliation can, without a doubt, break even the strongest among us. remove all hope, and can, above all, kill any amount of pride. When it says that Joseph was sold to the Midianites, to the Ishmaelites, and finally to the Egyptians, this was no mistake. In my opinion, there were 3 transactions. I don't know if there's a greater rejection in life than being betrayed and sold by a loved one as close as a brother. My thoughts are with the many girls and women in the Middle East who are going through this pain at this moment. And my prayer is that the Eternal will free them quickly and that justice will be done. We see the principle of midah keneged midah, measure for measure, in which the Eternal was working individually with the patriarchs of Israel for a greater purpose in the future. On one hand, Jacob lost his 2 sons, Joseph, who he thought was dead, as well as Judah, who had left after this terrible incident. Then Judah, having experienced the death of his 2 sons, Er and Onan, would understand his father's pain. On the other hand, Joseph, for a short time, having felt the pit of bitterness, was restored and would save his people and comfort his father. Another example of measure for measure was after Jacob had deceived his father using a goat. Now he would also be deceived with the blood of a goat. Then the story tells us how, despite his righteous acts, Joseph was brought to the point of being broken, stripped of any hint of an idea that he had special abilities, and that it is thanks to Joseph that everything turns out well in his life. This would lead him to learn firsthand that the only one who can save us is God, and that only God, no one else, permits apparent evil, because God alone knows the end of each life. Joseph learned that we cannot trust in our justice, in our abilities, or our wisdom or beauty, or in men like Potiphar, or the jailer, or the baker, the cupbearer, to take us out of the pit, the bore. Now back to the question, why should the Torah say that the pit had no water in it? Because water represents the Torah. That is, a bore, a pit without Torah, is equivalent to despair, to chaos, to be like the living dead. This is exactly what happened at the time of Matityahu and Judah Maccabee. They fell into the pit, and many evils came upon them because Israel had turned away from the Torah, away from our God. Our prophet Amos tells us how someone can lose the Torah in a practical way. It says, they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the helpless as if they were the dust of the earth, and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son sleep with the same woman, thus profaning my holy name. Next to any altar, they lie down on clothes they took as a pledge, and they drink the wine they have collected as a fine in the house of their gods. If we read this correctly, the principle of love of neighbor, love of the eternal, or of idolatry and moral decadence from which we had been prohibited from practicing in the Torah, was broken. We see then how being in the pit without the Torah influences us. In these past weeks, I have experienced adverse situations with my health, my economy, my family, work, my vehicle, etc., and I feel like I'm sinking into the mud of despair. However, I continue to wait for heaven's response, because my help will come from there. In our lives, God often allows us to fall into these pits. But as our Rabbi, our Ranabi, asked me at that time, the question is, Do you know the difference between the problems in your life? You can either face them with or without the Torah. When there is Torah, we have hope. But what a horror it is to fall into the hands of the Eternal without hope. At this season of Hanukkah, my wish is that the Eternal allows us to be light, and that we have the awareness that it is not we who shine because of our abilities, but is the Eternal who illuminates us. Hope will produce a miracle like the parable of the oil for the menorah at Hanukkah. We have hope that we will see in Joseph, since the Torah doesn't mention that he called upon heaven during all the difficulties in his life. He was rejected by his family. His father did not look for him. He was sold 3 times. He was unjustly defamed. He was put into jail. They forgot about him. No one thanked him for his service. And who knows how many more disappointments he had. But let us remember that these experiences prepared him to later become the viceroy of Egypt. Today, if you are not in a pit, live life with gratitude. If you are in a pit, thank God and receive him with joy. It means that you are growing. But above all, if you are in a pit, decide how you will endure it, with or without the Torah. Chanukah Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Mauricio.